In philosophy, terms like the world or reality are often used to denote something like a domain encompassing everything which is there anyway, to borrow Bernard Williams' oft-quoted phrase. This has been labeled the absolute conception of reality, which is usually contrasted with skeptical or ultimately crazy claims such as subjective idealism, solipsism, social constructivism, a la Rorty in his worst moments, and so forth. In Williams's wake, Adrian Moore, in his points of view, introduces as his basic assumption the idea that, I quote, representations are representations of what is there anyway. The truth of any true representation is determined by how the world is, by how reality is. There is only one world. This is what I mean when I talk about the unity of reality, end of quote. He explicitly contrasts this claim with nihilism, that is some version of the world well lost as declared by Rorty. I believe the exegetical question aside, which Nietzsche-inclined philosophers actually defended nihilism in Moore's sense. Also, I will not try to make sense of his concept of representations or points of view. However, I will defend a version of nihilism which is as far away as I could possibly imagine from Nietzsche, or rather from 20th century Parisian Nietzscheans and their heirs. In order to get to my position, I will first discuss some terminology, a discussion which is not merely verbal. Anticipating, by metaphysics, I understand a theory of the world as such, that is, an investigation into the meaning of the term the world or reality. Traditionally, metaphysics is associated with a range of claims from, say, Thales's that everything is water, to physicalism's more sophisticated metaphysics, according to which everything is some stuff, say, subatomic particles arranged so-and-so-wise, table-wise, European Union-wise, and so forth. Other forms of metaphysics in this sense are phenomenalism, subjective idealism, and so forth. In this sense, he may forgive me, in his Aufbau, Carnap has developed a system of metaphysics, just like Berkeley or popular physicists like Brian Greene. By ontology, I refer to the project of answering the question what existence is, or rather what existential predicates like exists, there is, for some, etc. mean. Ontology then also seeks to establish the proper relationship between the concept of existence and the formal regimentation of discourse. Against this backdrop, many contemporary ontologists question the simple version of Quine's identification of the concept of existence with the existential quantifier. Some ontologists, like Kit Fine, suggest a new existential predicate to be suitably regimented, whereas others believe that there is no such thing as a univocal concept of existence whose underived conceptual role could be fully captured by any form of well-defined existential predicate. Versions of this claim, sometimes referred to as Quantifier Variance, I will say something about this later, have been suggested by Hilary Putnam and Ellie Hirsch, to name but a few, and later Carnap's distinction between internal and external statements has been observed to be a forerunner to Quantifier Variance. In my own view, the right ontology entails that metaphysics in the traditional sense fails. The idea of a fundamental structure of reality, according to which this structure in one way or other guarantees the overall coherence of an all-encompassing domain of everything that is the case, or of everything in the vague sense of the whole of which we are part, is ontologically flawed. Accordingly, I will defend metaphysical nihilism, that is, the claim that there is no all-encompassing domain. This is what I will mean by metaphysical nihilism, and I will show you why this is not a crazy claim, and not revisionary in the bad sense. I'm not saying, just as a provision, I'm not saying that there is no universe, or that there is no external world, or any such thing. I'm saying there is no world. In advance, and very roughly, the intuition behind this can be stated as follows. To exist, or so I will argue, is to be encompassed, to belong to a particular domain. Any domain to which everything belonged could not belong to a further domain and hence cannot be said to exist. Belonging to a domain here is not identical with set membership because it is not the case that there are only sets. There are thoughts, itches, cities, and social objects, and I do not know any convincing argument which shows that their way of belonging to the world can or ought to be modeled along the lines of set membership. Interestingly, Aristotle, whom many see as the founder of ontology, introduced the science of being qua being, which has only later been called ontology, as a theory of domains. According to his definition of such a science, there are many particular forms of determining what there is, which depend on the domain under investigation. To ascertain whether there are infinitely many prime numbers is different from ascertaining whether there are weapons of mass destruction in Luxembourg, or whether there are many painters in modern art which live up to Picasso's expertise, which I hope does not amount to any form of relativism. Evidently, Aristotle, if anyone, is a prime ontological realist, which might count as evidence that ontological realism need not be committed to ontological monism, to the claim that there is one and only one all-encompassing domain, maybe a domain of all domains, such that this domain can be individuated with reference to its fundamental structure, and where the fundamental structure serves the job of specifying functions for belonging to the domain. Such a model might be successful in some science or other. I do not doubt that. But science is precisely not about the world in the sense of everything, but about the universe. By the universe, I mean the spatio-temporarily extended massive objects whose fundamental structures and stuff are investigated by science. When I say that there is no fundamental structure of reality, I am not intending to say that the universe does not exist, which might be a crazy claim depending on what one means by it. All I am saying is that there is no univocal concept of existence. The plurivocity of existence, however, does not give rise to ontological relativism, and it is not purely conceptual, as I will argue. With this orientation in mind, in the first part of my paper, I will first present a train of thought which I will call the argument from facticity. The argument from facticity motivates the conclusion that any reaction to the diagnosis of a vagueness and conceptual relativity of the existential quantifier, or existential predication more generally, need not and must not lead to a denial of the existence of absolute facts. I here run a kind of Bogosian argument, Bogosian-style argument against quantifier variance. You'll see how that works. The very discourse which investigates or states the manifold meaning of existence might come to the conclusion that there exists an X only has a determinate truth value relative to a language, a conceptual scheme, a culture, a person, or whatever suitable candidate you may come up with for a relevant frame of reference. Yet, even if you buy into any such account, this should not lead to the claim that the following assertion is concerned with a relevant fact, namely the plurivocity itself. There is a manifold meaning of there exists. If true, then, if anything, this has to be an absolute fact, suggesting that existential predication at least sometimes concerns absolute facts. In the second part of my paper, I will then briefly argue that an objectivism about facts, as Paul calls it, can accommodate the intuitions which misled a good deal of badly practiced mainstream cultural theory in the last century into superficial self-declared postmodern varieties of ontological relativism, even though I leave it open whether any of the French philosophers commonly associated with literary theory gone wild were ever really committed to any such claim, or whether there even is literary theory gone wild. Plurivocity and reality go together. However, there are limits to plurivocity set by the argument from facticity. In order to put more cards on the table and provide more orientation beforehand, let me just mention that by ontological realism, I do not refer to the more specific tenet associated with the term by contemporary ontologists, namely, I quote from Ted Sider, that the world's distinguished structure includes quantificational structure. Rather, by ontological realism, I intend to communicate the following set of claims, OR1 to OR4. OR1, the world has a complicated structure, and part of the complication is that there are many domains. OR2, this complicated structure is often the object of both our cognitive and practical activities. For example, when I think that to believe that it's raining is kind of, or to justify my belief that it's raining is not the same as to justify my belief that there are more prime numbers than 7. OR3, huge chunks of the world's complicated structure consist of absolute facts, an absolute fact being something which is true of something anyway. For example, it is true of the Earth-Moon anyway that it is not identical with all of space-time or with an itch in some dinosaur's toe in the distant prehistoric past. OR4, one of those absolute facts might be, I leave that open, that some human discourse is internally structured in such a manner that local conceptual relativity is the best diagnosis of this region of the structure. That depends on your discourse theory for a particular discourse, whether you might come up with one such absolute fact, but it would still be an absolute fact. The aspect of the world encapsulated by OR4, the world's local relative structure, has misled many theorists to believe that the structure of the world as such, or the world's distinguished structure, should be modeled along the lines of its local human all-to-human conceptual relativity. This move is, I believe, an illicit ontological generalization. Likewise, a good deal of contemporary metaphysics draws on an equally problematic ontological simplification. In the last part of my presentation, I will argue that ontological simplification is as conceptually misguided as the ontological generalization of postmodernism, which is why postmodernists often declared war on metaphysics, their unwanted sibling. So I come to part one, the argument from facticity. The argument from facticity sets out from the reminder that the concept of a fact is not limited to a particular domain of discourse. It is as much a fact that it's raining in London at T1 as it might be a fact that at T1 Brittany believes that it's raining in London. Hence, the concept of a fact is orthogonal to the mind-dependence, mind-independence distinction. The fact that Brittany believes that it's raining in London is certainly not completely mind-independent, for trivially, it would not have been the case that Brittany believed that it's raining had there been no mind. Whereas it might well have been the case that it's raining in the spatio-temporal domain we now identify as the territory of London, had no one ever had any belief whatsoever. Facticity, or facthood, is thus generally neutral with respect to the mind dependence or mind independence. Accordingly, if we do not restrict the concept of facts to a domain of discourse or to the domains of discourse in which the mind dependence, mind independence distinction is an issue, we must accommodate higher order facts into our ontological discourse. It is the case that there are beliefs about facts, and these beliefs about facts are themselves facts. I believe that insistence on this particular insight is a new twist in the realism debate and offers prospects for a new realism. A new realism is not a variety of a proof of the external world or a defense of common sense, but a result of the investigation of the prospects of a general denial of facticity. If there is any argument to the effect that there have to be absolute facts in order for there to be any facts whatsoever, this is sufficient for realism, and it raises new questions, for example, regarding realism about reason or rationality itself, given that there are at least facts about reason. So one question currently investigated in what I perceive as a new realism is, for example, whether you ought to be a realist about, say, modus ponens. And if you are, what does it mean? Because modus ponens or other logical laws, logical form, seem to have different properties from, say, stones. To find out that it's raining is in some way or other different from finding out that modus ponens is valid or for accepting counter arguments to modus ponens. Sometimes so-called postmodernist discourse develops around the idea that some item or other turns out to be socially constructed in a surprising way. Where large social groups formerly might have confused sex and gender, or so the story goes, we now know that there are issues of social construction of gender or race and other concepts. And there are indeed many social issues and associated domains of discourse about which people have been in massive error precisely because they neglected the conceptual relativity built into the relevant concepts or the relevant facts. Sometimes whole world pictures turn out to be some kind of mass hallucination, such as any world picture which divides things up into an ethereal heaven, a hellish underworld, and a human macroscopic domain of action. Unfortunately, world pictures like this one are not as antiquated as Aztec cosmology. While campaigning in Ohio, the Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum recently sketched his ideas about the proper theological account of hell and declared war on hell in the name of the United States of America. This really happened. Beliefs, but he will not become president, also I predict. Beliefs based on such a ground are very likely to be off the track, to say the least. If you throw an enemy into a pit filled with water in order to put him into contact with the gods of the netherworld, your action would correctly be classified as very deranged. No argument for conceptual relativity ever ought to convince us that it might be the case that pits are doors to the netherworld in that sense. The only pitfall here is the false belief about pits, just as belief in hell might be the only hellish reality I can imagine. Of course, the very idea behind pointing out a conceptual relativity in the context of social criticism lies in uncovering the historical contingency of a system of beliefs which actually govern our behavior to the detriment of moral and political progress. Pointing out the contingency of a belief system, such as the division of things into heaven, earth, and hell, sometimes actually helps grasp a particular set of facts of which a social group might have been completely unaware. When you tell the Aztecs, well, sorry, there's no, or Rick Santorum. Yet such more or less successful social criticism has often been confused with an incoherent relativism about epistemic justification in general. If one's diagnosis of this is that truth or any truth predicate as such is relative to a discourse and that all discourses involve some optional parameters, then one might conclude that there are no fully discourse-independent facts. And trivially, one might add, all facts with which we are concerned are stated within a discourse. Facts we consider indeed come in the form of propositions we believe, assert, defend, justify, etc. Accordingly, there seems to be no such thing as an absolute justification and consequently no such thing as an absolute fact. For every discourse is what it is in contrast or opposition to other discourses. To justify your belief that it's raining is different from justifying that 7 + 5 = 2 or that Georges Braque is a worse painter than Picasso. Yet, along those lines, you might wind up in paradox or simple incoherence. The fact that truth at thought and discourse are part of our access to what there is does not at all entail that the facts accessed by true thoughts are in any exciting way entangled in our access to what there is. If I use a door as an access to my bedroom, the fact that I access my bedroom through the door does not usually lead to me confusing my bedroom with my entering it. Even if some of the things I have just stated in my attempt to uncover some presuppositions of this global relativism Paul has talked about could really be cashed out, this would still not entail that they're only relational or relative facts. Why should we believe that the alleged fact that all facts are relative because they can only be registered relative to a discourse is itself a relative fact and not just a fact or truth to core? In other words, no diagnosis along the lines of the overall relativity of epistemic justification, if that can be made sense of, that's another question, suffices to justify the generalized proposition that all facts are, as a matter of fact, relational in the sense of relative to a frame of reference. Furthermore, this line of thought's incoherence can be illustrated by means of a by now familiar infinite regress. I'm not sure if it's on the handout, because Jens just sent me the handout. It's not. Okay. Well, very simple. If f fact always means f relative to x, a fact relative to a domain or relative to a discourse, then, of course, we get an infinite number of brackets, f relative to x, relative to x, relative to x, relative to x, and so forth. Because you will always be uncovering a fact if what you state is true. But given that you define facts as f relative to x, you get this infinite set of brackets. The argument from facticity, therefore, concludes that there are absolute facts. Or, if you allow me a grandiose formulation, if there's anything whatsoever, then by necessity there are absolute facts, one of them being that there's anything whatsoever. This can be illustrated by the help of a simple counterfactual situation. Imagine nothing existed. That is, erase everything from the list of things. There's no Earth, no Milky Way, etc. In order for this situation to obtain, it has to be a fact. Thus, even if there were nothing whatsoever, in this ordinary sense of there being something, there would still be at least one absolute fact, namely that there's nothing whatsoever. In order to avoid wild speculation about nothing, I will not argue that this entails that by necessity there is something rather than nothing, and rather come to my next point, ontological realism. A recent debate in ontology pivots around a term made popular, strangely enough, by Heidegger in the wake of Max Scheler. However, in contemporary debates, the term plays a substantially different role. I mean the term meta-ontology. It appears alongside meta-metaphysics, even though it is not quite clear what the relation between meta-ontology and meta-metaphysics might actually be. The terminological choice to introduce meta-ontology immediately raises the question, what exactly distinguishes a first-order ontological question from a meta-ontological one? The standard answer is based on something like the following consideration. Say two philosophers A and B discuss the question whether there really are tables and people. One denies their existence on the ground that there really are only subatomic particles, whereas the other defends their existence on the ground that it is quite plausible to believe that there really are tables and people. This debate is usually represented as a piece of first-order ontology. Accordingly, meta-ontology would be the investigation of the discursive mechanisms at play in rationally deciding an ontological dispute, an investigation also designed to decide whether there really is an associated ontological dispute. Meta-ontology would thus be the discourse theory of first-order ontology, where the later is a theory of the world, that is, a theory of its fundamental or explanatorily privileged structure. Meta-ontology investigates questions such as, what kind of objectivity is in play in ontology? What do we agree or disagree about in ontology? Being, existence, the fundamental nature of reality, the essence of what there is, or simply about what there is. Those are all meta-ontological questions in this standard sense. Let us refer to this version of a distinction between ontology and meta-ontology as the standard division of labor, the SDL. SDL is sometimes less succinctly articulated as the combined claims that first-order ontology is about what exists, and meta-ontology is about the rules we adopt or ought to adopt when attempting to answer ontological questions. First-order ontology asks what there is, and meta-ontology asks how we decide the truth value of particular answers to this seemingly perspicuous question. However, SDL is misleading. Consider first the definition of first-order ontology as a discourse about what really exists or what there really is. For many reasons, it seems dubious to me that the concept of real existence as opposed to existence, or the relationship between the meaning of expressions like there is, there really is, there exists, or there really exists, and so forth, is really clear. For example, if you think, we will come to this list, if you think that there's just one existential quantifier symbolized in the standard way, what would it mean to claim real existence in a particular case? Of course, real existence is contrasted with imagined existence. But then how do we cash this out ontologically? Just to give you an example, I will go into this in a second. What do you do with the contrast, say, in Proust, okay, between Proust talking about Monet and Proust, or the narrator talking about Monet and the narrator talking about Elstir. Okay, Elstir has been made up by Proust, never existed. There was no painter called Elstir. Okay, but there was a painter called Monet. So you want to say something, okay, that even within this fictional framework, okay, there's real existence as opposed to, say, imaginary existence. Or if you answer the question whether someone is hallucinating in a movie. So it's not that in the fictional case everything is hallucination and then there's real existence. In order to begin to tidy up the mess of ontological questions, I believe that we need to be able to maintain a contrast between the following kinds of assertions. 1, there really are no weapons of mass destruction in Luxembourg. 2, there really are witches in Macbeth. 3, there really are no witches. 4, there really are always monsters in my dreams. 5, there really or really only are subatomic particles. I will not say anything about the really only part of the really part. And 6, there really are no human beings. According to SDL, 1 to 6 are first-order ontological questions. And there would then be a discipline or branch of philosophy, meta-ontology, dealing with the regimentation of discourse pertaining to a language, say English, containing truth-apt versions of 1 to 6. But if 1 to 6 are first-order ontological questions, we lose track of the evidence in virtue of which SDL looks plausible in the first place. The debate between our two philosophers, A and B, relies on a contrast merely implicit in SDL. The contrast between their really being witches in Macbeth and the various ways of denying that they are witches in the universe, where the universe refers to the spatio-temporarily extended massive object whose fundamental structures and stuff are investigated by science, is different from the contrast envisaged by SDL. For SDL implicitly relies on the intuitive contrast between things seeming to be a particular way and things really being a particular way. For ontology is, of course, never meant to be the project to write a long list of everything. The ontological question, what is there, cannot be answered by writing down a list of things in my hotel room, the horrifying cockroach, the comfortable bed, and so forth. It is rather meant to give a systematic answer according to which there really are certain things, things of a certain kind, in opposition to other things not really being there. However, this contrast is unfortunately misstated if we tie it to the metaphysical question regarding the fundamental nature of the universe. If I observe that there are really witches in the Blair Witch Project or in Macbeth, I might be asserting, for example, that the witches are not only imagined by characters in the movie or the stage world, which is quite different from asserting that witches come with the fundamental structure of the universe. There's another observation which I am claiming calls into question SDL. Let us call an emphatic existential assertion any assertion to the effect that there really is X or that X really exists. I want to call this emphatic existential assertion. Now consider the case of negative emphatic existentials. To deny that there really are witches when confronted with a suspicious case may mean quite different things. If I deny that X is a witch on the grounds that only subatomic particles exist, I am claiming something quite different than someone who, more reasonably, I suppose, maintains that there really are no witches on the ground, that no woman is a witch, when the later term is superstitiously understood and does not refer to people disguised as witches on Halloween. As a matter of fact, I believe that we ought not to believe that there really are no witches on the ground, that there really are only subatomic particles. Instead, we ought to believe that there really are no witches on the ground, that it is ethically harmful to believe that there really are witches for any of the reasons or pseudo-reasons which have been given for such a claim. If someone told me that according to his layman opinion he believes that there are way too many witches in his neighborhood, even though metaphysically there are no witches because there are only swarms of particles, I would regard my interlocutor as very deranged. Honestly, if someone literally believed that I did not really exist on the ground, that there are only subatomic particles, this would already be a maddening situation. But the situation in which someone layman believes in witches, but physics professor wife suspends his beliefs, might even be worse. Quite simply, at least the following contrasts, which are operative in the 1 to 6 list, need to be more clearly drawn than suggested by the standard division of labor. C1, contrast 1, witches versus subatomic particles. Contrast 2, witches versus women. And contrast 3, witches in Macbeth versus witches in the universe. Or as Susan Harker said, we need an operator as opposed to. It has been quite important historically to recognize C2, namely witches versus women, as an ontological contrast. Whereas C1, namely witches versus subatomic particles, looks like a rather artificial, maybe even meaningless contrast, because in C1 almost everything contrasts with subatomic particles, apart from subatomic particles. So the contrast class might be too big. I will give an argument to this effect. So C1 looks bad, C2 is important to recognize, whereas C3 that is, witches in Macbeth versus witches in the universe, is a contrast most sane modern adult human beings are equipped to draw on an everyday basis. Let me summarize my take on what I have said so far. First, I do not believe that the underdetermined question whether there really are witches is a well-formed question of ontology. However, the questions whether there really only are physical objects or representations, whether there really only are facts, a fact being something which is true of something, or only individuals, an individual being a completely determined object, etc., are genuine ontological questions. Second, against this background, I believe that the later questions are best construed as metaphysical. In my view, in contrast to a metaphysical question, the proper ontological question is the following: how to account for the common usage of exists, there is, there are, which surfaces in assertions like to or for, in which we are not dealing with the question regarding the structure or the actual population of the universe. So I want to say, this is my suggestion, I want to define a fact as something which is true of something. It is true of my left hand that it has 5 fingers, and an individual as a completely determined object. So maybe my left hand with the 5 fingers is an individual, and a fact is something which is true of something. On this basis, to cut a story short, I suggest a different division of labor, where ontology is the enterprise which seeks to answer the questions, what is existence or what does existence mean? And metaphysics, on the other hand, is interested in the first order question, what there really is, that is, in the question how emphatic existentials function. For this reason, metaphysics is associated with the theory of the world as such, of reality as such, or of the unity of reality, or of the world's distinguished structure, or there are many candidates. So I think this is what metaphysics should be, and the other thing is ontology. And if that's your setup, okay, it looks like you might go into this direction of quantifier variance. Here's the original statement of quantifier variance. I will look at this a little bit more closely. Turns out there is no quantifier variance in Putnam, so quantifier variance is a very different claim. But I will be brief on that. But here's a famous quote from Hilary Putnam. How can the question whether something exists be a matter of convention? And the way he asks the question, he wants to say it is a matter of convention. The answer I suggest is this. What logicians call the existential quantifier, the symbol blah, and its ordinary language counterparts, the expressions there are, there exist, and there exists a, some, etc., do not have a single, absolutely precise use, but a whole family of uses, end of quote. I would not agree that the question here is a matter of convention. However, I think Putnam captures one important point that the 1 to 6 list that all propositions in the 1 to 6 list might all be equally true negative existentials. However, this does not lead into ontological relativism as opposed to ontological realism. On the contrary, as long as we do not postulate a distinguished structure in the sense of a singular, all-encompassing domain over which all our quantifiers range, we need not get into conflict here. If I claim that there are unicorns in my bedroom, am I saying something false? But there are unicorns, for example, in the antecedent of the conditional statement, just as there are no unicorns in my next phrase. The fact that there are various domains of discourse with quite different rules governing domain membership, and therefore preparing the ground for a successful attribution of quantifiers over the domain, is itself a very important fact, neglected by SDL. Yet it does not lend itself to relativism in the bad sense of the term. On the contrary, it may both serve as a tool to accommodate some intuitions which often go into the motivation of relativism, and an appropriately wide concept of existence to be analyzed prior to opting for this or that metaphysics. So I come to my last part where I have to be a little bit more brief because there are only 5 minutes left. Metaphysical nihilism. As I noted in the preceding section, I tend to agree with Putnam's claim that existence is plurivocal, or as he puts it, that our ontological vocabulary comes with some version of family resemblance. Contemporary ontologists sometimes classify this claim as quantifier variance. One way of cashing this out consists in indexing the existential quantifier where the index is meant to indicate some sort of conceptual scheme. But this is not what Putnam does, because Putnam works on the concept of object. famously he says something like, like earlier on, he says something like, well, object means different things in different domains. He doesn't say existence means different things in different domains. So I don't think that Putnam is defending quantifier variance at all. But here's what many people would believe quantifier variance is. Okay, so there are statements like, one, there are Macbeth witches, or as I read this, there are Macbeth are witches, is true, whereas there are New Jersey are witches comes out false. Ellie Hirsch has elaborated this idea with the clear goal in mind to maintain the idea of some unstructured facts which make both one true and two false. Often quantifier variance is diagnosed along the lines of Putnam's good old observation that the term object might be underdetermined. Object simply means something different according to different conceptual schemes or languages. In one way or other, these accounts draw a sharp distinction between some domain of unstructured facts or objects, call it the world, and different forms of grouping. The picture is one in which there are some things ready to be ordered in different manners. There are some technical difficulties for quantifier variance, which I can only briefly mention here because my interest is focused differently. Suffice it to say that there Macbeth are witches entails that something is a witch. Hence, 3, there Macbeth are witches entail that something is a witch. However, if you isolate, because you run a modus ponens on that, and now you have something is a witch, but something is a witch in turn entails there's something which is a witch. How do you choose the index appropriate for 4 to be fully determined? If there is no unrestricted existential quantification, then what does it mean to infer from some things being a particular way that there is something which is the particular way? The introduction rule for the existential quantifier turns out either logically uncontrolled or underdetermined. For there is no logical way to decide which index ought to be considered, and there are countless instances where many indices are possible. There are witches in Macbeth, in the Blair Witch Project 1, the Blair Witch Project 2, in Halloween parties, and so forth. So if you go from W on A to 4, there's no indication as to which index to use. So this looks as if we were completely lost when making existential statements. We would always have to ask ourselves, well, in which context do I find myself? Because that's uncontrolled. But existential elimination is fine, that's controlled. So how do you reconcile this tension between existential elimination and existential introduction if you're a quantifier variantist? However, the problem that is more relevant for the purpose of our conference is the following. Often the realism versus anti-realism, idealism, postmodernism, pragmatism, or what have you debate is presented under the auspices of an incoherent form-content dualism. My rejection of this dualism is motivated by a concern not mentioned by those classical criticisms. According to the argument from facticity, there are some absolute facts, if there are any facts at all. But those absolute facts need not be on the external world side of the form-content dualism. The absolute fact that I can sort the DVDs in my library according to different categories, director's genre, overall evaluation, year of release, etc., is not itself a DVD in my library. Yet, it is as absolute as the fact that the 39th governor of California is the actor who played Hercules in New York in the movie ranked last in my overall evaluation scheme. I don't own the movie, unfortunately. As I said earlier, the mind-dependence, mind-independence distinction is orthogonal to the contrast involved in developing the prospects for a new realism. The absolute fact that there are many ways of sorting my DVDs involves some at least partially mind-independent objects, namely DVDs, as well as some mind-dependent objects, such as my mind deciding how to sort the DVDs in my library. Quantifier variance, however, makes it look as if there were some unstructured facts and then some linguistic or semantic devices which carve reality up, sometimes at its joints and sometimes not. But just in order to conclude, you run into problems like these because you need a second-order index, but I leave that aside. So, just in order to conclude, what I want to say, I can't go into the details for lack of time, but what I want to say is this. there are various domains of discourse, and there are absolute facts about what makes up a domain of discourse. But then there are some domains of discourse which are in massive error, and when we find out that they are in massive error through discourse analysis, through science or whatever, we find out absolute facts about those domains. So nothing is ruled out a priori by ontological analysis about which domains there are and how they are structured. On the contrary, we need particular discourse theories for particular domains, and then for some domains it might turn out that they're systematically in error, and for other domains it might turn out that they're not, that they're surprisingly objective and so forth. The point is that there is no overall fundamental structure of reality, reference to which would ever put us in a position to decide which discourses are massively in error and which are not. It's always part of the relevant discourse analysis to put us onto this or that track. And all that I'm saying is meant to be a description of how things are and not a description of how we talk about things. Whereas both Quantifier Variance and in particular Hilary Putnam's 2004 Ethics Without Ontology view looks like they were only talking about our way to access domains or our way of grouping things into domains. But I want to say, well, there really are domains. Okay, I leave the rest for discussion.